in Christ. This is Ancient Faith Radio, timeless Christianity, 24 hours a day.
Search the Scriptures as Christ our God said in the Gospel.
This is Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Join us for an interactive verse-by-verse study of the Bible with one of Orthodoxy's most respected biblical scholars. Study along with us and share your comments and questions by calling 855-237-2346. That's 855-237-2346. Here now is Dr. Jeannie Constantinou.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Illumine our hearts, O Master who loves mankind, with the pure light of thy divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to understand thy gospel teachings. Implant in us also the fear of thy blessed commandments, that trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things that are well-pleasing to thee. For thou art the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God, and to thee we ascribe glory, together with thy Father who is from everlasting, and thine all-holy and good and life-giving Spirit, now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Well, hello, dear brothers and sisters, and welcome to Search the Scriptures Live. I'm Dr. Jeannie Constantinou, and today's date is August 19th, 2024. And we are in the Gospel of Matthew, just about to begin, Matthew chapter 19. And this is lesson 84 on the Gospel of Matthew. And we're going to be toggling back and forth between St. John Chrysostom and St. Gregory the Theologian today with their various insights on this passage about divorce. And also we'll be talking a little bit about the teachings of the Orthodox Church on the issue of divorce and why the Church allows it and the Catholic Church does not allow it. It has everything to do with our passage today. So that might help you in some of your discussions with some of your Catholic friends, perhaps. So Matthew chapter 19, before we begin to read it, I just want to remind you to sign up for my newsletter if you haven't done that so far, because people do sometimes ask me questions. I talk in the newsletter about a lot of other topics that we don't have time to discuss here, or they're not exactly about our subject. So, for example, once a month I send out an electronic newsletter. It's free. You don't have to pay anything for it. The last one that I sent out last week, we talked about the second coming of Christ. Somebody asked me, what do we know about the second coming? How is it going to happen? What's it going to be like? And another person had written to ask me about the Holy Trinity. How do we explain it? Do we have to be able to explain it or understand it? And so that was our subject matter last week. And it comes to your inbox of your email. You can cancel anytime, no strings attached. But if you're interested in that, I do encourage you to sign up for the newsletter and also submit your questions. I can only address the questions that have to do with what we're studying at the moment. So you can also, by the way, send me your questions about what you want me to discuss or answer or address in a future section of Matthew's Gospel. But if we've already talked about it, I'm not going to go back and rediscuss it. Or if it's something that just you wonder about having to do with the church or Jesus or the history of the church, feel free to write to me. And you can sign up for the newsletter by going to drjeannie.com, DRJEANNIE.com. And under my picture, there's a little button that says Join My Newsletter. And click on that, and it will take you to the page where you can sign up for the newsletter, okay? Be sure you have to respond. It's going to ask you to confirm, and you have to do that or you won't be signed up. But I encourage you to do that because people do pose some very interesting questions, and it's good for us. It's an easy way for us to learn about our faith. So here in chapter 19, we're beginning a new narrative section. So remember, St. Matthew's Gospel alternates between narrative and teaching, and narrative and teaching, and narrative and teaching. And those teaching sections are entire chapters. So we finished with chapter 18, which was an extended teaching section by the Lord. And now we see that Matthew is hinting to us that he's switching gears and returning to the narrative. We see this on a consistent basis throughout the Gospel of Matthew. So what I'm bringing out here is that he is deliberately shaping his gospel in this manner. And there's nothing wrong with that. None of the evangelists is giving us a blow-by-blow, day-by-day account of the ministry of Christ. It's impossible, okay, because so many things happened. He met so many people. There were so many miracles. Most of what Jesus Christ said and did was never written down. That's one reason why sola scriptura is absolutely impossible. The church did not operate with the idea that everything is in the scriptures and that's the only thing we need. Instead, the early church relied on oral tradition, and that existed. There were many, many, many more stories about Christ that the first Christians knew that we don't know, okay, because they were never written down. They figured everybody would continue to tell the stories about the Lord orally, but at a certain point that kind of diminished, and it stopped completely after like the 3rd century. So what we have today are the Gospels. Now the Gospels are enough. The teaching of the Orthodox Church is that what we have in the Gospels is sufficient for our salvation, but it doesn't contain everything Jesus said and did. So each evangelist crafted his gospel to answer certain questions or present what he thought we should know about Jesus Christ. And St. Matthew is sometimes referred to as meticulous Matthew because his very, very meticulous planning and organization of his gospel. So you will see this in each of the evangelists has a different way of transitioning, from one thing to the other. But we see this especially in St. Matthew's Gospel. So here we are in chapter 19, and I'm going to read for you the first couple of verses, and we see him deliberately starting a new section. Verse 1, Now when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan, and large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. Now, at the end of every teaching section, which is the first one is the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5, 6, and 7, Jesus concludes, Matthew, and helps us to understand. Matthew gives us that transition. He says, when Jesus had finished these sayings, he then did this and this and this. So at the end of every single one, this is exactly what Matthew does. When Jesus finished teaching these things, he got up and he did this. And then we also see that there's a transition from the end of the teaching section to the beginning of the narrative section, the end of the narrative section to the beginning of a teaching section. We have only one more teaching section. And at the end of that, Matthew says, when Jesus finished all of these sayings, in other words, he concluded all of his teachings, in other words, he makes it definitive that that's the end, then this and this happened. And that marks the beginning of the passion of the Lord, okay? So at any rate, that is the beginning of a new narrative, according to our evangelist. So notice that he says that Jesus left Galilee, which is up in the north, and went to Judea beyond the Jordan. So Galilee is up in the north, and then we have Samaria in the middle, and then to the south is the region of Judea. And so the Lord went south, and then he crossed the Jordan River and went over to the eastern side, and he was preaching there, and it says large crowds followed him, and he healed them out there in the wilderness. Now, St. Gregory the Theologian gave a whole sermon on the passage that we're discussing today, and he did not neglect to address this little we could say transitional statement not in the way that I just explained it to you, but he found something spiritual to say about it. I'm giving you this kind of scholarly analysis of what Matthew is doing by indicating this transition, that Jesus is moving from one place to the next. But St. Gregory the Theologian gives us a spiritual meaning to it. And this is one of the things that I think is most impressive about the fathers of the church. They will take what seems to be a very mundane verse in the Bible, and they see it full of spiritual lessons for us. Some time ago, a few weeks ago, I think, I gave you a portion of one of St. Augustine's sermons that was just about the phrase, and the Lord was passing by. He was passing by a blind man, for example, or he's passing by, and some lepers shouted out to him. We have lots of little statements like this. The Lord was passing by. And Augustine is inspired to give a whole statement about what it means that the Lord was passing by. So this is very typical of the fathers of the church. As spiritual men, they are able to see deep spiritual meaning in what we would consider a kind of throwaway verse, something not particularly important. So let's see what St. Gregory the Theologian says about this in his Oration 37. And it is actually this specific verse, Matthew chapter 19, verse 1, because after this he goes on to discuss marriage and divorce. So Oration 37 on the words of the gospel when Jesus had finished these sayings, etc. Jesus, who chose the fishermen, himself also uses a net and moves from place to place. Why? Not only that he may gain more of those who love God by his visitation, but also, as it seems to me, that he may hallow more places. To the Jews he becomes as a Jew, that he may gain the Jews. He's echoing St. Paul there. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that he may redeem them who are under the law. For he is made not only a Jew, and not only does he take to himself all monstrous and vile names, but even that which is most monstrous of all, even very sin and very curse. Not that he is such, but that he is called so. Now, what he's trying to say here is that St. Matthew said, and Jesus, when he finished these sayings, he went from the Galilee to the Jordan. And St. Gregory is saying that he did this so that he might sanctify every part of the Holy Land. Isn't that beautiful? And also that he might make himself accessible to all different kinds of people. Because Matthew says he went to this place and all the crowds came out, large crowds came out, and he healed them. So he's sanctifying the place and he's sanctifying the people by his presence. And he's saying that this is a condescension of the Lord. Now, he doesn't use this word. Chrysostom would have used that word. He mentioned it. All the fathers mentioned the condescension, the synkatavasis, the great condescension of the Lord in the incarnation and in all of his activities. But here he just says that he allowed himself to be called every kind of name. And of course, they were calling him blasphemer, Samaritan. He's, uneducated. He's, somebody who from Nazareth. All these things that were intended to make him look like he was somehow not worthy to be teaching, not capable of teaching, that he was doing the work of the devil, these kinds of things that we have seen already. So here St. Gregory the Theologian is telling us that he allowed himself to be called even sin and curse. Now, here he's referring to the place in the scriptures where it says that Jesus became a curse for us. And now he's going to explain that. If you ever wondered what that meant, how does Jesus become a curse? Not that he is such. He's not sin and he's not curse, but he is called so. For how can he be sin who sets us free from sin? And how can he be a curse who redeems us from the curse of the law. But it is in order that he may carry on his display of humility, even to this extent, and form us to that humility which produces exaltation. In other words, he's giving us an example of humility. An example of humility. And as I said then, he is made a fisherman. He condescends to all. He means metaphorically, because he began by saying Jesus becomes a fisherman by drawing people into his net by going to all of these places. He condescends to all. There's a synkadavasis. He casts the net. He endures all things, that he may draw up the fish from the depths. That is, man who was swimming in the unsettled and bitter waves of life. A very common patristic metaphor. Therefore now also, when he finished these sayings, he departed from Galilee and came to the coasts of Judea beyond the Jordan. Well, has to be the coast of the river, can't be the coast of the sea. Because if it's beyond the Jordan, it's on the other side. It's inland that he's referring to. He dwells well in Galilee, in order that the people who sat in darkness may see a great light. He moves to Judea in order that he may persuade people to rise up from the letter and follow the Spirit. He teaches, now on a mountain, now on a plain. He passes over into a ship, and now he rebukes the surges, and perhaps he goes to sleep in order that he may bless sleep also. Perhaps he is tired, that he may hallow weariness also. Perhaps he weeps, that he may make tears blessed. He moves from place to place, who is not contained in any place, the timeless, the bodiless, the uncircumscribed, the same who was and is, who was both above time and came under time, and was invisible and is seen. So notice, of course, he's speaking extemporaneously, by the way. Extemporaneously. This is the theologian. This is Gregory the Theologian, who said such powerful words, who was such a powerful orator, that he changed the city of Constantinople, which was 100% Arian, all of its churches, and brought them back to the Orthodox faith by the power of his preaching. And he is a phenomenal orator. So he's beginning to just get carried away with his own oratory, talking about all these different things. But these are observations that all of the fathers make about the incarnation of Christ, and it's very high up in his mind because he was fighting Arianism, which denied the incarnation. Now, the Arians would not have denied, or would not have said that they were denying the incarnation of the Son of God, because they said, we believe that Jesus is the Son of God, but not God by nature. He was created by the Father. That's what they said. The Arian heresy, that's what they taught. That is, in fact, a denial of the incarnation. But notice how powerful it is, and how he's opposing Arianism here. And believe me, I have to explain this to you because you don't realize what he's doing here. But his audience would have understood exactly why he's talking about how the presence of the Lord on earth sanctified every single place and every person he came into contact with, not to mention human nature itself, because we understand what the incarnation did for us, that it sanctified our human nature, but we don't really think about how the presence of the Lord on earth sanctified everything. We see this kind of thing, for example, in the baptism, when we remember the baptism of the Lord at Epiphany. We talked about how his presence there sanctified the Jordan River, and this is why we go out at Epiphany or Theophany, and we have a blessing of the waters. We bless the waters just as the presence of Christ on this physical earth blessed creation. And this is something here that all of the fathers brought out, but Gregory the Theologian is doing very beautifully right here, reminding us of that. So the one who was before time, above time, now came under time. The one who was invisible was seen. So let us continue with St. Gregory's words. He was in the beginning and was with God and was God. The word was occurs the third time to be confirmed by that number. What he was, he laid aside. What he was not, his humanity, he assumed his humanity. Not that he became two, he deigned to become one, made out of two. Notice here that whole, another heresy, Nestorianism, had not yet begun. But he anticipates it by saying that even though he was God and he became a human being, he didn't become two things. He became one person in Jesus Christ. But what has befallen me? I have fallen into human language. He recognizes that he's gotten a little bit off topic. He just becomes inspired to say all of these things about Christ. So he says, but pardon the word, for I am speaking of the greatest things with a limited instrument. And that great and long-suffering and formless and bodiless nature, he's speaking about the divine nature of Jesus Christ, that great suffering and formless and bodiless, long-suffering, formless, bodiless nature will endure this, namely my words, as if of a body and weaker than truth. For he condescended to become flesh. He will also endure such language. Okay, notice that. He, like Chrysostom, is talking about how all of our human language about God is inadequate. It's just inadequate to express the enormity of the incarnation, the nature of God, or any such things. We do the best we can, and all we have is human language. But notice he, for all of his eloquence, recognizes the poverty of his own words as unable to express. He finds that he's incapable of really saying what deserves to be said about God because of the limitations of human language. So he returns to his discussion of the scriptures. This is now chapter 19, verse 2. He's quoting the scriptures. And great multitudes followed him and healed them there, where the multitude was greater. If he had not condescended to infirmity, that is, to become human, if he had remained what he was, divine only, keeping himself unapproachable and incomprehensible, perhaps a few would have followed him. Perhaps not even a few, possibly only Moses. But inasmuch as he strips himself for us, inasmuch as he comes down and speak of an enfeebling, as it were, laying aside and a diminution of his glory, he becomes by this comprehensible. I don't even know where to begin with what St. Gregory just talked about, how God becomes something that we can understand, we can comprehend. And this is why he became a human being, not just to die on a cross to save us, but to become something that we can relate to. It's very difficult to relate to the Father except through the image of Father, but God really isn't a male. He certainly isn't an old man in the sky. The Spirit is even harder to comprehend or relate to, because what is spirit? And yet Jesus Christ we understand, and we can relate to him because he appeared as a man and he lived a human life. So he was incarnate as a man, just didn't appear, but you know what I'm trying to say. So this is what St. Gregory is saying, that he allowed himself to take on this human form, to lay aside his glory, to become enfeebled. Here he is recalling the words of St. Paul in Philippians chapter 2, that famous Philippian hymn, that he did not count equality with the Father something to be grasped, but emptied himself and took on and became a human being and became a servant and condescended to die, even a death on the cross. This is what he's talking about. And by this, the Son of God became comprehensible. And he continues, pardon me, meanwhile, that I suffer again a human affection. I am filled with indignation and grief for my Christ, and would that you might sympathize with me when I see my Christ dishonored on this account, which he most merited honor. That he's dishonored because he became a human being. Is he on this account to be dishonored? Tell me. That for you he was humble? Is he therefore a creature because he cared for a creature? Here again, he's addressing heresies. Christ was not, he became a creature, but he was not as God a creature. He was not created by God the Father. That's why in the creed we say begotten, not created. God the Father did not create the Son. He begot the Son. He begat the Son. There's a difference. Light, from light, true God of true God, begotten, not created. So here he's saying that those people who were saying at the time that he's a creature have dishonored him because they've denied the magnificence, the incomprehensible nature of the condescension of God to become man for our sakes. And that's a dishonor. It was like we're not respecting or appreciating what he did. Is he therefore a creature because he cared for the creature? Is he therefore subject to time because he watches over those who are subject to time? In other words, the Arius said that there was a time when the Son did not exist. And that's a big heresy. No, he always existed because he was God. But he allowed himself to become subject to time in his incarnation. So notice how we have to understand something about church history and something about theology in order to understand the fathers when we read their explanations of the Gospels. That's why I'm explaining it to you. The people who were alive at the time, because they were wrestling with these issues and fighting this heresy, did not need this kind of explanation. But we could apply it to the Jehovah's Witnesses, who believe that the Son of God is a creature, who was God but created by God the Father. Well, that's dishonoring the Son, isn't it? It's a heresy. It's dishonoring him. So, returning to Gregory the Theologian here, he says, is he therefore subject to time because he watches over those who are subject to time? That's us. Is he a creature because he cares for us, the creatures? No, of course not. He bears all things. He endures all things. And what a marvel! He puts up with blows. He bore spittings. He tasted gall for my sake. And even now, he bears to be stoned, not only by those who deal despitefully with him, but also by ourselves who seem to reverence him. For to use corporeal names when discoursing about the incorporeal is perhaps part of those who deal despitefully and stone him. But pardon, I say again to our infirmity, for I do not willingly stone him, but having no other words to use, we use what we have. Now he's saying I'm stoning him because I'm unable to describe what he did appropriately. So it's like throwing stones, because my words are like stones. They're that useless. This is what Gregory the Theologian is saying. You are called word, and you are above the word. You are above light and are called light. You are fire, not as perceptible to sense, but because you purge light and worthless matter. But as I was saying, to return to my argument, for this reason great multitudes followed, because he condescended to our infirmities. Okay, so isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? What he draws out of that two little verses. And Jesus left from Galilee and went to Judea, and great crowds followed him. So it's time for our break. I thought was going to get farther, but it looks like we're going to be talking about this pericope next week. But for now, just take a break for 1 minute and come back. Okay?
Dr. Constantinou will be back in a moment, but the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
The crucifixion and resurrection of Christ are central events in our salvation. Yet few Christians have a good grasp of the first-century historical and religious context in which the crucifixion took place, nor of its true significance for the people of that time, and hence for our time as well. In her book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, biblical scholar Dr. Jeannie Constantinou puts modern readers in the center of the events of Christ's Passion, bringing the best of modern scholarship to bear while keeping her interpretation faithful in every particular to the early church tradition. If you love Search the Scriptures live on Ancient Faith Radio, you'll also love The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, available now at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
We're back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
Okay, so we're talking about the Oration 37 by St. Gregory the Theologian, talking about our pericope for today. A pericope is a little segment, and the pericope is about divorce, and the Pharisees questioning Jesus about divorce. It took St. Gregory a long time to get there because he was so inspired by the fact that it said that Jesus moved from one place to another. And isn't that really the mark of a saint? To see such depth and such power in something so simple? We just say, yeah, Jesus walked from here to there. But look at that. Just look at the mind there, the holiness of the person, and then the eloquence that I'm sure stirred and moved his beautiful congregation there in the little church. Now, I'm not sure where he delivered this sermon, but could very well have been there in that little tiny church that he constructed, because every other place was full of heretics. Okay, so let's continue. St. Gregory the Theologian. But as I was saying, to return to my argument, for this reason great multitudes followed him, because he condescended to our infirmities. What next? The Pharisees also, it says, came to him, tempting him, and saying to him, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? So now he gets to the main story that Matthew is starting the chapter with. So we're going to read this pericope that addresses the issue of divorce, which was a very famous controversy in Judaism during the first century among the Pharisees. So I'm going to read this section of Matthew's Gospel, and then we're going to talk a little bit about it. Matthew 19, beginning with verse 3. And the Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? He answered, have you not read that he who made them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man put asunder. They said to him, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? He said to them, for your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for unchastity, and marries another, commits adultery. So let's stop right there. And we're going to go back to the very first line of this pericope, which is verse 3. It says, the Pharisees came up to him and tested him. But the word there is tempted him. The same word that we have seen elsewhere when the Pharisees confronted him. It's a very intentional word. Pirasmos, the temptation, is the same word as temptation. To pirazo means to test or to tempt. It's the same word that's used way back in chapter 3 when we talked about the temptation of Christ by the devil. So the reason why that word is chosen by the evangelists when the Pharisees confront Jesus or ask him a question is because it shows that behind the question is this desire to trap him somehow. That's why they use that word, but it doesn't seem to fit well in English to say the Pharisees came and tempted him. Well, we usually think of temptation as, something physical, a beautiful woman for a man, or a handsome man for a woman, or, some lovely thing to eat that you're not supposed to eat. We think about temptation in that respect. But that the word that is used here is used very deliberately, pirazo, because the evangelist is trying to show us that they had an ulterior motive. The Pharisees, they wanted to trick him or to trap him, to get him to say something wrong. So just as when they asked him for a sign from heaven, I think that was back in chapter 11. So a better word might be trap, but it's not exactly the word trap either. So how is this a test or a temptation or a trap? Because they probably expected the Lord to ignore the law, because he tended to be, to their mind, rather liberal, right? He was not encouraging the keeping of ritual purity. They brought the woman accused of adultery to him, and he said, the one who is without sin cast the first stone. So they left, the scene, these kinds of things. They saw Jesus as rather, we could say, on the liberal side, because he didn't insist on the kind of exactitude of the law. So it says in Deuteronomy that if a man finds his wife guilty of some kind of, I'm going to read you this exact verse later, that a man wants to divorce his wife, he can do that. And Deuteronomy says how to do that, but doesn't really give the parameters of what justifies divorce. That's why it was an argument among the Pharisees at the time. And there's still disagreement. We see it in the Talmud. There's still big disagreement among the Jews. So they might have also, they might have thought he was going to say, hey, you can divorce as much as you want, divorce and remarry, there's no rules. Maybe that's what they expected of Jesus. Or perhaps, possibly more likely, they wanted him to say something against divorce so that they could take that to Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas, the king of Galilee, remember, he was the one who was married to Philip, his brother's Philip, or at least a male relative named Philip. His wife, she left him and she took up with the other Herod, Herod Antipas, king of Galilee. And because John, the forerunner, was critical of that, he lost his head. So maybe they hoped Jesus would say something that would cause Herod to arrest him. That's possible too. That is very possible. So it could be potentially very dangerous here. So Chrysostom thinks that they wanted to trap him into contradicting the law so he could, lose all credibility. So let's talk a little bit here about Jewish law having to do with divorce and what this meant, marriage and divorce. I think it's useful for us to talk about these things from a historical perspective so we can understand what Christ is doing here, because by taking a very traditional conservative approach that divorce is not something to be done lightly or easily or for just any cause, but here he gives one exception. We'll talk about that later. I want you to understand, it seems very strict to us, especially in a modern culture, in a place like California and most states today, which have no fault divorce. It used to be to get a divorce, you had to go to court and prove that somebody did something wrong or bad. And it resulted in the husband and the wife trashing each other in court. It was a very unseemly thing. So they said, no fault divorce. You don't have to prove that somebody's at fault. Just check irreconcilable differences. We can't get along, basically. And I remember when this happened. I was a child. But I remember this because there was a lot of discussion about this. And they said, isn't that terrible? You can just check a box that says irreconcilable differences. But the reason is the courts were clogged with people who didn't want to be married. And then in order to get out of the marriage, they had to find some reason. The person did something wrong, so they would, have detectives following the husband or the wife, and they had divorce court, real court, where they said terrible things about each other because they couldn't easily get a divorce. So this is why the law was changed. But that's the civil law. We're talking about the law of God. That's a different matter. But because the Lord seems to be very strict about this, this is why we might not understand why he takes this position. That's why I'm going to explain to you what life was like for women in first century Judaism, and still for women who are Orthodox Jews. So women were usually absolutely powerless when it came to marriage and divorce. They were powerless in first century Judaism, and they still are among especially the most conservative Jewish Hasidic Orthodox sects. A girl's father decided whom she would marry, and he made that arrangement during a very specific period of time. He had to make this arrangement when she was between the age of 12 and 12 and a half. If she was one day older than 12 and a half, he could make an arrangement, for marriage, but she could repudiate it. She could decide not to marry the person. But within that window of time, between the age of 12 and 12 and a half, a father had complete control over who his daughter married, and she had no say in it she had absolutely no say. She was just acquired by the man to whom she was married. And this left her absolutely dependent upon the man she married, and she had no, as I said, choice in the matter. And that also meant that if she wished to divorce later, she had no ability to divorce. She had no opportunity to divorce because divorce was the prerogative of her husband alone. So the wedding contract was signed, and it is called a ketubah. A Jewish wedding contract is a ketubah. To this day, when Jewish people get married, they have a ketubah. I don't know if absolutely every Jew has it, but most of them do, and they kind of think of it as a romantic thing. It's written in very beautiful, calligraphy, and they hang it on the wall of their house, but it's a contract. And I just want you to imagine and understand how different this is from the Christian concept of marriage. So the Jewish marriage for a very long time was based on contract. Now this itself is actually a development in Judaism in what it was called, the period that was called Second Temple Judaism. This is the period of time in which Jesus is living. Prior to this, there was no contract. So the contract was considered a great improvement because it gave the wife certain rights. She had rights by the ketubah, by contract. Prior to that, she didn't have any rights. Now at least she has some rights, and so the ketubah was considered an improvement for women because it gave her certain rights. So what kinds of things did the ketubah or the wedding contract specify? It specified that the husband was required to feed her, provide her with food and shelter and clothing and conjugal rights. That's contractual. Now, in some actual wedding contracts that have been discovered, in ancient wedding contracts, they specify exactly how much food she must be given, so much in the amount of dried figs, so much amount of flour, so much amount of barley, and so much of fruit. Literally, the actual amount is stipulated in the contract. So these kinds of things, and also, of course, the right to new food, new clothes, sandals, new clothing, and sandals twice a year, exactly. But it also stipulates what the wife has to do, because when you have a contract and there are two parties, there always have to be requirements on both sides. Otherwise, it's not a contract. Both of the parties have to agree. They both have, it's called satisfaction. Okay, for a contract, you have to have an agreement, what they call satisfaction. That means somebody does something to their own detriment or gives something up in order to have the contract. Without satisfaction, there's no contract. So what was the wife supposed to do? was the husband supposed to get for this? There were contracts, there were contractual obligations on the part of the wife, certainly conjugal rights, and also in the time of Christ, she was required to produce a certain amount of cloth. Weaving was one of the most essential and important things that women did, and only women did weaving. And this was one of the ways that she contributed to the income of the household by producing cloth. And so these kinds of things were actually stipulated in wedding contracts during the first century, and they're still, I don't think the weaving is part of a modern Jewish ketubah, but this was normal, okay? So the duties and obligations of the wife were specified, and as well as her dowry. So the husband had to give some amount of money to the father. Usually it was a negligible amount. It was more of a symbolic thing. And the father gave certain objects or property or amount of money to the husband. The father of the bride gave the money to the husband. That's her dowry, which she was entitled to receive back if there was a divorce. Now, the husband could do whatever he wanted with the property. He could invest it, he could use it, or if it was land, he could grow things on it. He could get the benefit of the property during the course of the marriage. But if he divorced her, the husband had to give the property back. That was her only security. And that sometimes may have helped avoid a divorce, especially if he spent the dowry. Then he can't divorce her because he can't give her back her dowry. Now, the difference between a concubine, a live-in woman, and a wife is that the wife had a ketubah. The wife had a contract which gave her certain rights. Now, I want you to think about how St. Paul speaks about marriage in the passage on Ephesians, which is the epistle reading we read at the marriage ceremony of an Orthodox wedding, of the sacrament of marriage. Husbands, be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. You're never going to hear that in a Jewish ketubah. Be subject to one another. But look at how Christ changes everything out of reverence for Christ. Wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord. In other words, because Christ gave this example of humility and obedience to God the Father, which is exactly what St. Gregory the Theologian was just alluding to. This is why the wife is subject to the husband in imitation of Christ. And then he goes on and says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. What does that mean? You only have to fulfill certain contractual obligations? Of course not. You love your wife in a sacrificial way, in a self-sacrificial way, that he gave himself up for her, for the church. Jesus died on the cross, right, for us. So husbands have to be willing to do that. How different is that image of marriage from the Jewish one? It couldn't be more different. So it is with that kind of attitude that Jesus is addressing marriage, not to speak about not avoiding divorce or restricting divorce to keep people chained in some kind of hellish relationship, but so that we would rethink what marriage really is. And Chrysostom talks about this. Why would you want to be married if you're living the way St. Paul describes? So how different is this? Because there are elements of Christians, there are groups of Christians, fundamentalist Christians, who say that wives are supposed to submit to their husbands. They forget about the part as to the Lord, who doesn't lord himself over us. Jesus didn't make demands on us. Jesus didn't say, you have to obey me and do whatever I say, and that's it. Can you see how different that is? This idea of the subservient wife, and this is a wonderful thing, and they think this is great, this is the greatest thing. The wife just salutes and says, whatever you say, and she has no say, she has to be silent and submissive. This is not what Christ stood for. This is not what Paul was even saying. I'm not suggesting that there's some kind of a balance in the relationship. Yes, it's clear that there's a headship of the husband. But St. John Chrysostom said, in the slightest, somebody has to be the head. Okay? But this idea of the submissive, subservient wife, she's just going to obey and all this, that is not what Christ had in mind. That's not what Paul had in mind, according to the fathers of the church. That's the ancient Christian tradition. If we go back to this kind of rigidity of rules, because the reason why we know it's not rigid is because St. Paul began that passage by saying, be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ, remembering Christ. So we don't have this kind of rigidity of rules in the early church. The ideal marriage is not to have this. So this is because there's a sharp contrast that St. Paul is making between the Jewish model of marriage and a Christian one. It is not based on only doing what you're required to do by contract. Okay? So the early church never had, Christians didn't have a ketubah. You don't have a ketubah today. You don't have a marriage contract. The Christians didn't say, how far must I go to fulfill my contractual obligation? How different would your marriage be if it was based on a contract? Where is there room for love, for self-sacrifice? Now, I'm not suggesting that Jewish couples don't love each other. I'm not suggesting that at all. If they have a ketubah, that there's no love there. But just there's an idea that it puts into your mind about the nature of marriage, that it is not a relationship grounded in Christ in which we submit ourselves to each other, in which there is this mutual respect, and sometimes the wife submits to her husband, and sometimes the husband submits to the wisdom of the wife. What's wrong with that? That's a very different model than the Jewish model. But the contract, the ketubah, was kind of a safeguard for the woman, because in Judaism, because she didn't choose her husband, and she could be divorced by him at any time. So I just want you to realize this, because there's this idea that women have suffered because of Christianity, because of the patriarchal notions that Christianity somehow instilled in the culture. No, there's no patriarchy here. There really isn't. Not if you understand it correctly, and the fathers of the church tell us exactly how to understand these things. There's no domination of the man over the woman. And by the way, we're going to see how even our beloved St. Gregory the Theologian is going to address that here. If I ever shut up when we get to it. I don't know that we'll get to it today. But, there's this idea that women have suffered because of the Christian faith. Not the early church, certainly not Orthodoxy. When we get married, we don't have vows. We do not take vows. There is a blessing on the couple to live according to Christ. There's no vows. There's no obligation. There's no till death do you part, nothing like that. Okay, so the point is that, let's go on to talk about, we'll hear what St. Gregory has to say about it. The reason why the Lord responded in the way that he did was actually a great benefit to women. And Christ was the great liberator of women. It is because of Christ that we see women in the early church being equal to men, doing all kinds of ministries in the early church. And St. Paul saying things like, which is amazing for a Jewish man, which Paul was, to say in Christ there was neither male nor female, nor Jew nor Greek, nor slave nor free. This is the church. We don't care about status. We don't care about gender. Not that there aren't roles for that women are not allowed to participate in, like the priesthood. It's not about that. But women are not subservient to men in the church. And they're not, there are Christian groups who say that women can never teach men That's fundamentalist Protestant. That's not the Orthodox Church. The women can never teach men. That's absolutely ridiculous. And we never saw that in the early church, so we know that that's wrong. So Christ was protecting women by making divorce something which is disfavored, because the women, the only protection they had, because they couldn't choose their husband, and then they couldn't divorce him ever. The husband was in a tremendously superior position under Jewish law, and the only protection she had was contractual, and that if he divorced her, he had to give back the dowry. Only the man had the right to divorce. A woman had no legal power to divorce her husband. If he wanted to divorce her, it was solely at his discretion, his opinion. She also, if she was in a terrible marriage, she couldn't force him to divorce her. She couldn't compel a divorce. Even if she wanted to leave him, she couldn't leave him. He could be abusive. He could be repulsive. He could be difficult. She had no right to divorce him, but he could divorce her under, and according to some Pharisees, for no reason, practically no reason at all. So the question the Pharisees asked was this: is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause? Now notice, the question is not whether or not somebody could be divorced at all, but about the grounds for divorce. This is what they're asking Jesus. And here is St. Gregory the Theologian, and he begins by addressing the question of why the Lord even answered them, okay? Because they were testing him or tempting him. Sometimes the Lord didn't answer them, sometimes he did. So let's hear St. Gregory the Theologian about why the Lord even answered the question. Again, the Pharisees tempt him. Again, they who read the law do not know the law. They are expounders of the law, but they need others to teach them. It was not enough that the Sadducees should tempt him concerning the resurrection, and the lawyers question him about perfection, and the Herodians about the tax. But someone asks him about marriage. Him who cannot be tempted, the creator of wedlock, he who came from the first cause and made this the whole race of mankind. He answered and said to them, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning, male and female, no, he made them male and female at the beginning. He knows how to solve some of their questions and to bridle others. When he is asked by what authority you do these things, he himself, because of the utter ignorance of those who asked him, replies with another question. The baptism of John, was it from heaven or from men? On both sides to entangle his questioners, so that we also are able, listen to this, following the example of Christ, sometimes to check those who argue with us over officiously, and with still more absurd questions, solve the absurdity of their questions. Notice that he's saying everything doesn't deserve an answer. Christ sometimes answered, sometimes he didn't. But we have to be careful about whether or not we engage with people who ask us questions. Gregory says, but when he sees a question that calls for reasoning, then he does not deem his questioners unworthy of prudent answers. So sometimes the Lord does answer when it's not a ridiculous question, but something that is worthy of an answer, that he can give a rational, in other words, they're capable of understanding the reply. Okay, let's take a little break, and when we come back, we'll take a look at the basis for Jewish laws on divorce and why the Lord answers the way he does. Okay, join me after the break.
Dr. Constantinou will be back in a moment, but the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
Planning your wedding and reception can seem overwhelming, with countless details hijacking your time and energy. In the book Crowned, an Orthodox Christian wedding guide, authors Krista Fedorchak and Delaney Clodfelter help you identify your big 3 priorities to guide your decisions while keeping the emphasis on marriage as an Orthodox Christian sacrament. Use this resource to help you simplify the process and keep Christ at the center of your wedding day. Now available at store.ancientfaith.com. Again, that is store.ancientfaith.com.
We're back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
All right, so he answers them with the, have you not read that he who made them from the beginning made them male and female, and for this reason a man shall leave his father's mother, be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one. And what God has brought together, let no man put asunder. That's the way the Lord answered. So his answer has nothing to do with their debate. The debate was between two main schools of thought that the Jews had, and he combines these two quotations from Genesis to make the point that this is how God made him, that this is what God intended. The question was about Moses and about current Jewish practice. So the Pharisees really did not expect this answer. So the Jewish law of divorce is based on a passage from Deuteronomy chapter 24, and I'll just read you verse 1. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes, because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a bill of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs from his house. So all he had to do is write a bill of divorce called a get, G-E-T, hand it to her, it was supposed to be witnessed, hand it to her, and she had to leave. That's it. That's how easy it was. All he had to do is find something that's translated sometimes as indecency, sometimes translated in with other words, but something unsatisfactory about her, and then he could just divorce her. So the question of the rabbis was, what do the scriptures mean if she finds no favor in his eyes because he's found some matter of indecency? What does that mean? Indecency or disfavor or something like this. So there was a more conservative school called the School of Shammai. That was the name of a famous rabbi. And they assumed that that idea, a reference to indecency, meant that there had to be some kind of misbehavior of a sexual nature on the part of the wife to justify the divorce. Okay? But there was a very liberal school called the School of Hillel that said he could divorce her for any reason because they're not focusing on the word indecency, but if he finds some matter, in other words, any reason, some reason, and they interpreted the indecency of something just that he's dissatisfied with her for some reason, and that was enough. So rather than focusing on the meaning of the word indecency or something unsatisfactory about her, they focus on the word matter. So it can be for any reason. And they actually said Hillel, this famous rabbi, said that a husband could divorce his wife simply for burning his dinner. Okay, something as trivial as that. Now, remembering the fact that women had zero protection from this. Now, what is she supposed to do when she's divorced? And by the way, her children stay with the dad. Think about the burden that placed on women. Think about the fear that they lived with, that if they did something that made their husbands angry or upset, he could divorce them like that. Give her back her dowry, and especially if she is poor and didn't come with much of a dowry and he still had it, go out, leave my house, you're out of here. And where was she supposed to go? Back to her father's house? The father might not take her. Where's she going to live? I mean, it's a shockingly unfair situation that put women at such risk. But if you want to know why they were so subservient to their husbands, this is why, because they were threatened with this every day, and they knew it. What were they supposed to do? Be homeless? What alternative did they have? If they could try to get married again, what if she was older? She was an older woman. Who's going to marry her? What option does she have? To become a prostitute. That's her option. I mean, it's a horrible situation. But that was the reality for women in first century Judaism. Now, to go farther, this is after the time of Christ, but I'm telling you this opinion because it's a very famous rabbi, Jewish rabbi Akiba, who is like a hero to many Jews. They just adore him. He's all over the Talmud and the Mishnah, his opinions. He became famous. He was in the late first century, early second century. Rabbi Akiba said that a husband can divorce his wife even if he simply found someone more beautiful. How about that? It's always going to be someone more beautiful. How does that compare to Christian marriage, I ask you? You know, when we talk about the difference between Judaism and Christianity, it is night and day. The way the Christians were expected to live, the values that they had, what Christ expects of us is tremendously different. So, you know, yes, the church came out of Judaism, but it is not at all the same. Not at all the same. So, Rabbi Akiba doesn't even require that the wife have done anything to displease him. It's just if he finds somebody prettier. So the husband can become insane, abusive, whatever. She cannot divorce him, but he can divorce her for absolutely any reason. And this is because for purposes of marriage, a woman was property. She was chattel. The man acquired her and he could dispose of her. It's that simple. So, I mean, when you think about the relationship between husband and wife in this type of situation, the situation that women found themselves in, it was terrible. So Christ argues against divorce on the basis of creation. He doesn't care what Moses said. He's looking at what God intended. That's before the fall. You see? That's what we're supposed to model, the situation for humanity before the fall, because we're trying to return to that. What did God intend? He did not intend divorce. Divorce is a concession to human sin and weakness. Okay? So, St. John Chrysostom says, and many fathers said that God said that marriage is to be between one man and one woman. And if it had been God's will that there be divorced, he would have created one man and many women. And that's a kind of a common patristic observation, so that the man, if he didn't like the first woman, he could have put her away and chosen a different one. You see what I'm saying? So this is something that Chrysostom and other fathers of the church said. Now, St. Gregory the Theologian mentions, and I love this, the double standard that existed in the law of Moses. Not just in the way that the husband had all the power to marry the wife and then to put her away, to divorce her for virtually no reason, and leave her only with her dowry, which, especially if she was poor, was not very much, certainly not to support herself, no way to support herself. So, so Gregory the Theologian notices that double standard, but also the double standard in sexual behavior between men and women in Judaism. Only a woman could commit adultery, a wife, and the husband only, a man could commit adultery only if he was with another man's wife. That meant a married man could go with another woman as long as she was not married. That's a double standard. Okay, Christ, of course, does not have that. The church does not have that, but that was the Jewish standard. So this is what St. Gregory is talking about here. St. Gregory the Theologian, Oration 37. The question which you have put seems to me to do honor to chastity and to demand a kind of reply. Chastity, in respect of which I see the majority of men are ill-disposed, and that their laws are unequal and irregular. So he's sort of talking about what Christ would say. Now, by chastity in the church, chastity is not necessarily virginity. There is chastity in marriage when both partners are faithful to each other. That is also called chastity, okay? Married people are chaste when they are faithful to each other. It's back to Gregory. For what was the reason why they restrained the woman but indulged the man? He's talking about the Jewish law here. That a woman who practices evil against her husband's bed is an adulteress, and the penalties of the law for this are very severe: death. But if the husband commits fornication against his wife, he has no account to give. I do not accept this legislation. I do not approve of this custom. They who made the law were men, and therefore their legislation is hard on women. He's absolutely right, since they have placed children also under the authority of their fathers, while leaving the weaker sex uncared for. God does not do so. Isn't that amazing? But said, honor your father and your mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may be well with you. Similarly, he gave honor to good and punishment to evil. Do you see the equality of the legislation? So here, St. Gregory the Theologian is contrasting the law of God, which treats men and women equally. Mothers and fathers are both to be honored, that he punishes sin, whether it's done by a man or a woman, and rewards virtue, whether it's done by a man or a woman. And so he is contrasting that, God's way of viewing things, with human ways of viewing things, especially here, the laws that were created by the Jews, which, because they're made by men, favor men and are designed to control women and to punish them more severely. See, you see how Christ pays no attention to these things. So how can anyone say that women are oppressed because of Christianity? That's utterly ridiculous. See the equality of the legislation. There is one maker of man and women, one debt owed by children to both parents. How then do you demand chastity while you yourself do not observe it? How do you demand that which you do not give? How, though you are equally a body, do you legislate unequally? If you inquire into the worse, the woman sinned, and so did Adam. The serpent deceived them both. The one was not found to be the stronger and the other the weaker. But do you consider the better? Christ saved both by his passion. Was he made flesh for the man? So was he also for the woman. Did he die for the man? The woman is also saved by his death. He is called seed of David, and so perhaps you think the man is honored, but he is born of a virgin, and this is on the woman's side. They two, he says, shall be one flesh. So let the one flesh have equal honor. That's the fathers of the church, dear brothers and sisters. Look at that wisdom. The fathers of the... Yes, go ahead. Okay. I am being told by our lovely Matushka Trudy that there's a question that came in. I'm troubled about something. Why do you think God of the Mosaic Law set up such an unfair situation for women? Well, that's exactly what St. Gregory the Theologian said. God did not do this. Men did this. Men, this is the law of Moses. Okay, now, he is going to answer this, and I'm about to talk about this, and I'm not sure if we're going to get to it today, but we will next week, because this is a very important question. Why are certain laws in the Bible at all? Because we think of the Bible as the Word of God. We're going to talk about how certain concessions were made. But notice here that remember that Christ came to fulfill the law. That's what St. Matthew's Gospel emphasizes again and again and again. Christ is the fulfillment of the law. In other words, certain concessions were made because of human weakness, but Christ came and fulfilled the law, so we're not supposed to live in this manner anymore. We're not supposed to live like Jews, in which the man dominates and the woman must only be submissive. That's not what Paul meant at all. And we see that by so many places in the Gospels. And by the way, Christ treats women. He had women as disciples, and that was unheard of in Judaism. So Christ treated women equally. They were saved equally. He died for both men and women. And that's why in the church there's neither male nor female. We have the same rules in the church for our salvation. We have the same guidelines. We don't have certain services that are only for men. We don't require a quorum of men before we can have a church service. We don't require certain things of men and not of women. We don't require certain things of women and not of men in the church. Everybody is equal in Christ. That's what St. Paul meant when he said, in Christ there is neither male nor female. The way we are saved in Orthodox Christianity doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman or a slave or a free or a Jew or a Greek or anything else. Rich or poor, everybody has to do the same things, okay? So we're going to continue to address that perhaps in a bit more, elaborate on that a bit more. I'm not so sure how far we'll get today. But I want you to understand this. So the Lord said, let not what God has brought together, let not man put asunder. So the man who would do the separating would be the husband. Okay, the husband when he says don't let man put asunder, that would be the man. The husband would be the one who would tear the marriage asunder, not a judge or something. We think let no man put asunder. We think, oh, a judge would, or the state grant you a divorce. No. It's the husband who grants the divorce, who compels the woman to be divorced by handing her the get, the writ of divorce. Okay? So husbands had the sole discretion to divorce the wife. So, but in a wider sense, the Lord Jesus, when he says, let not man put asunder, he's also saying that what God has created, the work of God, should not be undone. God has said there's one man and one woman, and you've come together, stay together. Human rules and human laws should not be created to undo the will of God. That's what he's saying here, okay? We have, and the Pharisees were very good at that, creating human rules and customs to contravene the will of God. So, however, when we talk about what Jesus says, he continues to talk about if a man divorces his woman and marries another, except for adultery, except for unchastity or fornication or adultery, he commits adultery if he marries someone else. Now, again, the words of Christ are very harsh compared to what we're accustomed to in terms of divorce, but it's actually very protective of the woman who was treated as property. She had no choice in whom she married. Can you imagine that kind of a situation? She couldn't divorce him. She couldn't leave him for any reason. She had to just suffer through it. She receives her dowry back, as we said, but that's it. So imagine the potential for abuse by the husband in that kind of situation, the potential for whether it's psychological or emotional or anything else. Now, rather than the marriage being for the benefit of both parties, it really was or could become, again, I'm not suggesting that husbands didn't love their wives or come to love their wives and vice versa, but it's certainly a situation in which the man sees himself as having certain rights or prerogatives over the wife, and she just has to accept it. She has no choice in the matter. Chrysostom said that the parties have to keep, if the parties know, the reason why the Lord said that there should not be divorce is that if the parties know that they have to make the marriage work, they're less likely they're more likely to treat each other better. And of course, especially if we are Christians, Chrysostom says, how is one who is meek and a peacemaker and poor in spirit and merciful? He's echoing the earlier part of Matthew's gospel, the Beatitudes. How can this person divorce his wife? Why would he put away his wife? And Chrysostom is right. If we are living as Christians, we make the marriage work because we're treating the other person with love and respect, and we are submissive to one another as to Christ. So, all right. So another question came in. Is the purpose of allowing divorce for adultery because of the spiritual ramifications of two people outside the marriage becoming one flesh? How is that supposed to be rectified in the case of a reconciliation? We're going to talk about that. We might have to put that off till next time. Now, I will answer that in the Jewish, according to the Jewish law. If there was if a woman remarried after her husband put her away, and she could not come back, that follows that first verse that I read from Deuteronomy 24. He was not allowed. The first husband was not allowed to welcome her back. She couldn't divorce the second guy and come back to the first guy. And that was, again, part of the law of Moses. The reason for the adultery, it's more spiritual reason. It's not simply because that they have become one flesh. Sometimes people think, well, if you've had, and I know there are Protestants who believe this, that if you have committed fornication, if you've had intercourse before premarital, you've literally married yourself to that person and you have to get married. This is not what the church teaches. This is not the reason that they've become one flesh and therefore they're stuck with each other for all time. It's not about this. It has nothing to do with this. So let us continue with whatever time we have left by introducing the follow-up question, because the Lord's response is not what the Pharisees expected. His point is God did not intend divorce. God does not approve of divorce. This is the law of Moses. This is a human regulation. And he responded by talking about the will of God. So his response prompts the Pharisees to ask a follow-up question. Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and put her away? He said, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for unchastity, the word there is fornication, in other words, sexual impropriety, and marries another commits adultery. So, Moses did not command divorce. Notice what the Pharisees say. Why did Moses command someone to give a divorce? He doesn't command a divorce. Okay, but if a man wants a divorce, he has to give her a divorce, a writ of divorce. The law of Moses stipulates that. But Moses didn't command that they divorce. But I want you to pay attention to this, and we'll continue with this into more detail next week. But the answer of the Lord is this: because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And this is sort of what these two questions people submitted online were getting at. So this is not the will of God. And this is something that St. Jerome points out, that Christ is answering and talking about what God wanted versus what ended up happening. It's not that God allowed divorce, but that Moses introduced this. Now, of course, it's in the Bible. I'm not suggesting, and of course, it was allowed by the Jews, and God allowed it. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because very often people will pose questions to me like, why did God allow this in the Old Testament? It can be any number of things: slavery, polygamy, ritual purity. Why does God allow these things in the Old Testament, whereas today he does not. And the answer of the Lord is right here. Because of your hardness of heart, he allowed this. Or sometimes we could also modify that. Why did God command certain things? Why didn't the Lord tell the Israelites to love their enemies instead of saying, get rid of the Canaanites from the land? Why didn't God explicitly talk about the Holy Trinity in the Old Testament? People have asked me that question. Because of what they were capable of understanding or doing. So, because of the hardness of your hearts, Moses allowed you to divorce. But that's not the will of God, but obviously God allowed it because Moses allowed it, and it's in the Bible. So God allowed it because as a condescension to their weakness and sinfulness. So it is not the will of God that people be slaves, but it was allowed because they were incapable of understanding how evil that was and changing their ways. So the same thing with polygamy. So there might have been some historical reasons God allowed it, but it is not what God willed. So the will of God, in terms of the relationship between husband and wife, is seen in Genesis before the fall. That he makes her out of the side of the man, that's Genesis 2, and places her alongside of him. And it says, and Adam says, this and now at last is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. He places her alongside, and there is implied equality. Equality. Oh, I will make a helper for him. That doesn't mean that she's supposed to be a slave. Because she comes out of his side, and stands alongside him, and she's made from exactly the same stuff as the man, because she comes out of the man, there is an implication of equality. Just as in Genesis chapter 1, when it says male and female, he created them. In the image and likeness of God, he created them. Male and female, there's a difference, obviously, between male and female, but one is not better or superior to the other. That's the point. Genesis 1 and 2 are before the fall. Men and women are equal. Now, after the fall, things change, right? When the woman, she says, oh, the serpent made me do it. And he says, because of this, your husband will lord it over you. The man is going to dominate. That is a consequence of the fall. That's a consequence of sin. Now, what happened? Because of the resurrection. The consequences of the fall are gone. That's why St. Paul says that in Christ, there's neither male nor female. We don't live with the consequences of sin except death. We all still die. But this is why, pay attention to the hymns of the church. Again and again and again, the hymns of the church talk about how Eve is liberated. And she exults and she rejoices. She no longer, in other words, womanhood, womankind, is no longer supposed to be subject to the oppressive authority of men. That's what that means. Obviously, we all die, but otherwise, the church operates very differently than Judaism. Everything that happened before the resurrection of Jesus Christ was done because of human weakness. So God, said, he doesn't tell them you have to love your enemies. Of course not, because that meant that they would start consorting with the idol worshipers, and they weren't capable of that. And they would start worshiping idols. Or he doesn't say, the God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, because they would think that there were three gods. They weren't capable of understanding that. So these regulations existed or were allowed in the era of the Old Testament before the coming of Christ, because they were a babysitter. They were a guide. They were the pedagogos. That's St. Paul's explanation in the book of Romans. These laws were put in place by God through the actions of Moses and the writings of Moses and other regulations, so that there would be some guidelines for the Jewish people, so they wouldn't go completely nuts with no guidance at all. Just as when you were a little child, your parents had a lot of rules for you. You couldn't cross the street by yourself. You couldn't turn on the stove. You couldn't answer the phone. But as you got older, there were fewer limitations. And now as an adult, you are free. You don't have those rules exactly the same. Christians do not live according to the law of Moses. And those regulations don't apply. And the consequences of the fall do not apply because Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law. That's what that means. And we say that in so many places in the hymns and prayers of the church. Anyhow, we will continue this discussion. We've reached the end of our time. We will continue this discussion about the law of Moses, the Orthodox Church and divorce. We'll talk about that a little bit more, and then we'll continue after that. But we've run out of time tonight. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. Excuse me for being a little long-winded, but I think these are important things to talk about. So let us now close with our prayer, and I'll see you next week as we continue this discussion. Lord, now let your servants depart in peace according to your word, for our eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to enlighten the Gentiles and the glory of your people, Israel. Good night. Amen.